We have this rather strange idea in our culture that maintaining personal boundaries makes you difficult. We've been taught from childhood that a good person is always available, always accommodating, always flexible. If someone needs you, you show up. If someone asks for your time, you give it. If someone crosses a line, you smile and let it slide because, well, that's what nice people do. And if you dare to say no, if you dare to protect your own space, your own time, your own energy, well, then something must be wrong with you. You must be selfish. You must be cold. You must be lacking in compassion. But what if I told you that this entire notion is backwards? What if the inability to set boundaries, the compulsive need to say yes to everyone, to be everything to everyone, is not actually kindness at all, but a form of self-abandonment, a slow erosion of your own dignity, a betrayal of the very thing that makes you human, your autonomy? Think about it. When you constantly override your own needs, your own limits, your own sense of what is right for you, what are you really doing? You are not being virtuous. You are disappearing. You are teaching the world that you do not matter, that your time has no value, that your personhood is negotiable. Now, I'm not suggesting we become isolated or disconnected. That would be another extreme, wouldn't it? The question is not whether we should care about others. The question is how we care without losing ourselves in the process. And more importantly, why maintaining boundaries is not just practical advice, but a profound moral obligation to yourself and paradoxically to others as well. Because you see, there is something philosophers have understood for centuries that our modern culture seems to have forgotten. Each human being possesses inherent dignity. Each person, including you, is an end in themselves, not merely a means to someone else's happiness. And when you fail to honor your own boundaries, when you allow yourself to be used, depleted, exploited, you're not just harming yourself. You're participating in a system that treats human beings as instruments, as tools, as resources to be consumed.
Let me take you on a journey through the philosophy of personal boundaries. Not the self-help version with its lists and tips, but the deep ethical foundation that explains why boundaries matter, what happens when we lose them, and how reclaiming them is an act of both self-respect and moral clarity. Let's start at the beginning. In the 18th century, a German philosopher named Immanuel Kant proposed something radical. He said that human beings should never be treated merely as means to an end, but always as ends in themselves. What does this mean? It means that every person has inherent worth that cannot be reduced to their usefulness to others. You are not valuable because of what you do for people. You are valuable because you exist. Because you are a conscious being capable of making choices, of setting your own goals, of governing your own life. This capacity for self-government, what Kant called autonomy, is the very thing that gives you dignity. Now here's where it gets interesting. If you possess this dignity, if you are indeed an end in yourself, then you have not just the right, but the responsibility to treat yourself with the same respect you would show to any other person. When you allow your boundaries to be violated, when you permit yourself to be used as a mere tool for someone else's agenda, you are contradicting the very principle that makes you worthy of respect in the first place. Think of it this way. Would you stand by and watch someone else be exploited, drained, taken advantage of? No. Your moral instinct would tell you to intervene, to protect them, to insist on their dignity. But when it comes to yourself, you hesitate. You make exceptions. You tell yourself that your needs don't matter as much. But this is philosophically inconsistent. If all persons deserve respect, then that includes you. John Stuart Mill, writing about liberty in 1859, put it even more bluntly. He said, "Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign." Sovereign. That word means ultimate authority. Mill was saying that you and you alone have the right to determine what happens to your person, your time, your energy. No one else has the authority to decide that for you. But notice what's happened in our culture. We've inverted this principle. We act as though everyone else has sovereignty over us. Our boss can demand our evenings. Our family can claim our weekends, our friends can monopolize our emotional energy. And we go along with it because we've been taught that to be good is to be available, to be endlessly giving, to have no limits. Mill also introduced what he called the harm principle. He argued that the only justification for interfering with someone's liberty is to prevent harm to others. In other words, you should be free to live as you choose, to set your own boundaries, to make your own decisions, as long as you're not hurting anyone else. Now apply this to boundaries. When you say no to a request that would deplete you, are you harming anyone? Or are you simply exercising your sovereignty over your own life? When you decline to attend an event that exhausts you, are you being cruel? Or are you recognizing that you have the right to determine how your time and energy are spent? The answer is obvious, but we've been so conditioned to feel guilty for protecting ourselves that we can't see it clearly anymore. Let me describe what life looks like without boundaries, and I want you to be honest with yourself as I go through this. See if any of it sounds familiar. First, there is exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep can fix because it's not physical tiredness. It's the exhaustion that comes from constantly overriding your own needs, from living in a state of perpetual self-neglect. Second, there is resentment. You find yourself angry at the people you're helping. You feel bitter about the demands being placed on you. And then you feel guilty about feeling resentful because after all you said yes. You agreed to it. But here's the truth. Resentment is your psyche's way of telling you that a boundary has been violated. It's an alarm system. And when you ignore it, when you push through it, you build up a reservoir of bitterness that eventually poisons everything. Third, there is the loss of self. You start to forget what you actually want, what you actually think, what you actually feel. Your identity becomes defined entirely by what you do for others. You become a function, a role, a service provider. And the person you were, the person with dreams and desires and preferences, slowly fades away. Fourth, there is the breakdown of reciprocity. Aristotle wrote extensively about friendship, about what he called philia. He argued that true friendship is based on mutual respect, on a balance of give and take. But when you have no boundaries, there is no balance. You give and give and give, and others take and take and take. And what you end up with is not friendship but exploitation. And here's the tragedy. The people taking from you may not even realize they're doing it, because you've trained them. You've taught them that your needs don't matter, that they can ask anything of you, that you will always say yes. And so they keep asking, not because they're bad people necessarily, but because you've never shown them otherwise. Fifth, and perhaps most insidious, there is the loss of dignity. Remember Kant's principle? Treat humanity, whether in yourself or in others, as an end and never merely as a means. When you allow yourself to be used, when you permit your time and energy to be consumed without limit, you are violating this principle. You are treating yourself as a means to someone else's end. And here's what's crucial to understand. This is not just a personal problem. This is a moral failure. Not because you're a bad person, but because you're participating in a system that denies the fundamental dignity of persons. You're allowing yourself to be treated as less than fully human, as a resource rather than a person. Now let me walk you through 7 unmistakable signs that your boundaries have collapsed. These aren't just symptoms. They are philosophical indicators that something fundamental has gone wrong in how you relate to yourself and others. 1. You cannot say no without guilt. There are people who can decline a request with ease. They hear the ask. They assess whether it aligns with their priorities, and if it doesn't, they politely say no. And then they move on with their day. But if you have poor boundaries, saying no feels like a moral transgression. Your heart races, your stomach knots. You feel like you're doing something wrong, like you're failing in some fundamental way. And so you say yes even when everything in you wants to say no. This guilt is not random. It's a sign that you've internalized a false belief, that your worth is conditional on your usefulness to others, that you only deserve to exist if you're serving, giving, accommodating. But remember Mill's principle. You are sovereign over yourself. You have the right to determine how your time is spent. Saying no is not a betrayal of others. It's an affirmation of your own autonomy. When you say no without guilt, you are practicing self-respect. You are recognizing that your time, your energy, your life has inherent value, that it is not a resource for others to claim at will. 2. You feel responsible for others' emotions. Let me ask you something. When someone is upset, do you immediately feel like it's your job to fix it? When someone is disappointed, do you scramble to make them feel better? When someone is angry, do you apologize even if you've done nothing wrong? This is a boundary issue. Because here's the truth. You are not responsible for other people's emotions. You cannot control how others feel. And when you take on that responsibility, you are doing two things. First, you're treating yourself as a means to their emotional satisfaction. Your value becomes tied to your ability to manage their feelings. Second, you're denying them their autonomy. You're treating them as fragile, as incapable of handling their own emotional life. Existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre emphasize that each person is radically free and radically responsible for their own existence. We are, as Sartre said, condemned to be free. We must define ourselves through our choices, and we must take ownership of our emotional responses. When you try to manage someone else's emotions, you're interfering with their existential responsibility. You're preventing them from doing the work of understanding and regulating their own inner world, and you're exhausting yourself in the process. 3. You apologize constantly. I'm sorry. How many times a day do you say those words? And how often are you actually sorry for something you did wrong versus just sorry for existing, for taking up space, for having needs? There are people who apologize for asking questions, for needing help, for not understanding something immediately, for having a different opinion. They say, "I'm sorry," before they speak, as if their very voice is an imposition. This is what poor boundaries look like. It's a constant, reflexive minimizing of yourself. It's treating your presence as a burden, your needs as unreasonable, your existence as something to be excused. Kant would ask you this: do you have dignity? Are you an end in yourself? If the answer is yes, then your needs are not impositions. Your questions are not burdens. Your voice is not an intrusion. You have as much right to speak, to need, to exist as anyone else. When you apologize for things that don't require apology, you are reinforcing the belief that you are less than others, that you must constantly seek permission to take up space in the world. 4. You overextend yourself to the point of collapse. Aristotle taught the concept of the golden mean, the idea that virtue lies between two extremes. Courage, for example, is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and wastefulness. The same principle applies to giving. There is a balance between selfishness and self-destruction, between caring for others and caring for yourself. The virtuous person finds the middle path. But when you have poor boundaries, there is no middle path. There is only giving until there's nothing left. You say yes to everything. You take on more than you can handle. You ignore your body's signals, your mind's exhaustion, your soul's depletion. And then you collapse. And when you collapse, you're no longer able to help anyone, including yourself. This is not virtue. This is not love. This is a distortion of both. True generosity comes from overflow, not from emptiness. You cannot pour from an empty cup, as the saying goes. But more than that, you shouldn't be expected to. Nature shows us this principle clearly. A tree does not give fruit by destroying itself. It gives from its abundance, from the nourishment it has taken in. When it has been watered, fed by sunlight, rooted in good soil, then it produces. But if you strip the tree bare, if you demand more than it can sustainably give, the tree dies. And then there is no more fruit. You are not designed to give endlessly without replenishment. And when you try, you are violating the natural order of sustainability that governs all living systems. 5. You attract users and manipulators. Here's something interesting. When you have weak boundaries, you don't attract a random assortment of people. You attract a specific type. You attract people who need someone with weak boundaries. The person who respects autonomy, who values reciprocity, who believes in mutual dignity, that person will not try to exploit you. But the person who sees others as resources, who believes the world revolves around their needs, who has no qualms about taking without giving, that person will find you immediately. Why? Because you are safe for them. You will not push back. You will not demand respect. You will not hold them accountable. You will let them take and take and take, and you will feel guilty if you even think about stopping them. This creates a vicious cycle. The more you give without boundaries, the more you attract people who want to take. And the more you're surrounded by takers, the more exhausted and depleted you become. And the more depleted you are, the harder it is to set boundaries. John Locke wrote about self-ownership, the idea that you own yourself, your body, your labor, your time. Just as you wouldn't let someone steal your property, you shouldn't let someone steal your time and energy. But when you have no boundaries, you are essentially declaring that you don't own yourself, that anyone can claim your time, your energy, your resources, and manipulators hear that declaration loud and clear. 6. You feel like a victim of your own life. There's a strange paradox that happens when you live without boundaries. You start to feel powerless in your own life. You feel controlled, trapped, overwhelmed by demands. You feel like life is happening to you rather than something you're actively shaping. But here's the uncomfortable truth. In most cases, no one is forcing you. No one is holding a gun to your head. You are choosing to say yes. You are choosing to take on more than you can handle. You are choosing to prioritize others over yourself. The existentialist would say you are in bad faith. You are lying to yourself about your own freedom. You are pretending that you have no choice when, in fact, you do. Sartre would say that even when circumstances are difficult, you always have the freedom to choose your response. You can choose to set a boundary. You can choose to say no. You can choose to walk away. The fact that these choices might be uncomfortable, might lead to conflict, might disappoint others, does not mean they aren't choices. When you feel like a victim, you are denying your own agency. You are treating yourself as an object acted upon by the world, rather than a subject actively making choices within it. And this is perhaps the deepest betrayal of your own dignity. Because to be human is to be free, to have autonomy, to be able to make choices about your life. When you abandon that freedom, when you pretend you don't have it, you are abandoning your own humanity. 7. You have lost touch with your own desires. The final and perhaps most tragic sign of poor boundaries is this. You no longer know what you want. Someone asks you, "What would you like to do?" And you go blank. You default to, "I don't care, whatever you want." Someone asks about your dreams, your goals, your preferences, and you realize you can't answer. Not because you're being polite, but because you genuinely don't know. This is what happens when you spend years overriding your own desires in favor of others. Your internal compass stops working. The voice that says, "I want this," or "I don't want that," grows so faint that you can't hear it anymore. Kant argued that autonomy, self-governance, is the essence of human dignity. But how can you govern yourself if you don't know what you want? How can you make authentic choices if you've lost touch with your own preferences, values, and desires? You become a shell, going through the motions, living according to everyone else's script but your own. And at the end of your life, you look back and realize you never actually lived. You served, you accommodated, you pleased, but you never became who you were meant to be. This is not humility. This is not selflessness. This is self-erasure. And it violates everything philosophers from Aristotle to Sartre have taught us about what it means to live a good, authentic human life. The restoration. Building healthy boundaries as a moral practice. So what do? How do we restore what has been lost? How do we reclaim our boundaries without becoming cold, selfish, or disconnected? The answer lies in understanding that boundaries are not walls. They are not barriers meant to keep everyone out. They are rather a form of clarity. They are a way of saying, this is who I am. This is what I can give. This is what I cannot give. And respecting these limits is how we maintain genuine, sustainable, dignified relationship. Let me give you a metaphor. Think of a cell, the basic unit of life. A cell has a membrane. This membrane is not a solid wall. It's semi-permeable. It lets certain things in, nutrients, oxygen, things the cell needs to thrive. And it keeps certain things out, toxins, waste, things that would harm the cell. Without this membrane, the cell cannot exist. It would simply dissolve into its environment. It would lose its integrity, its identity, its ability to function. Your boundaries are your membrane. They allow you to take in what nourishes you while keeping out what depletes you. They maintain your integrity, your identity, your ability to function as a healthy, autonomous person. When you set a boundary, you are not being selfish. You are maintaining the conditions necessary for your own flourishing. And your flourishing is not optional. It's not a luxury. It's a moral necessity because you matter. Your dignity, your autonomy, your personhood has inherent worth. How to set boundaries with wisdom and compassion. First, recognize that boundary setting is a skill. It's not something you do once. It's something you practice, refine, and strengthen over time. Start small. If saying no to a major request feels impossible, start with minor things. No, I can't talk right now. No, I'd prefer not to. Practice the words. Get comfortable with the discomfort. Second, use what philosophers call the categorical imperative. This is Kant's test for moral action. Ask yourself, would I want everyone to treat themselves this way? If your friend were in your situation, exhausted, depleted, overwhelmed, would you want them to say yes to one more demand? Or would you want them to protect themselves? Apply the same standard to yourself that you would apply to anyone else. Third, embrace Mill's harm principle. You should be free to make your own choices as long as you're not harming others. And here's the key. Disappointing someone is not the same as harming them. Making someone uncomfortable is not the same as harming them. Declining a request is not the same as harming them. Harm would be violating their rights, attacking their dignity, causing them suffering through malice or cruelty. But saying no to a request? That's not harm. That's just the exercise of your own autonomy. Fourth, practice Aristotle's golden mean. Aim for the balance between self-sacrifice and selfishness. Give from overflow, not from emptiness. Help others when you can do so without destroying yourself. Recognize that there is a middle path between being a doormat and being a fortress. Fifth, cultivate what feminist philosophers call relational autonomy. This is the recognition that we are all interconnected, that our autonomy develops in the context of relationships. Healthy boundaries don't mean isolation. They mean being in relationship in a way that honors both your dignity and others' dignity. You can care deeply about others while still maintaining limits. You can be loving and generous while still protecting your own well-being. These things are not contradictory. In fact, they're complementary. Finally, remember Sartre's existential responsibility. You are free. You are responsible for your choices. You cannot blame others for your lack of boundaries because you are the one who must set them. This is not a burden. This is your power. Every time you set a boundary, you are exercising your freedom. You are defining yourself. You are claiming your existence as your own. What about love, compassion, and sacrifice? Now I know what some of you are thinking. But what about love? What about sacrifice? Didn't Jesus teach us to lay down our lives for others? Didn't every spiritual tradition emphasize selflessness? This is where we need to be very careful, because there is a profound difference between chosen sacrifice and compulsive self-abandonment. Chosen sacrifice is when you, from a place of strength and fullness, decide to give something valuable for a worthy cause. Think of a parent who works long hours to provide for their children. or a soldier who risks their life to protect others, or a person who donates a kidney to save a sibling. These are sacrifices, yes, but they are made from a place of autonomy. The person choosing them is not being manipulated or guilted into it. They're not doing it because they're afraid to say no. They're doing it because they have weighed the cost, considered their values, and made a free choice. This is entirely different from the person who cannot say no, who gives because they feel they have no choice, who sacrifices not from love but from fear or obligation. True love, true compassion, flows from wholeness, not from brokenness. When you give from a place of depletion, when you help others because you're terrified of being seen as selfish, when you say yes because you don't believe your own needs matter, that's not love. That's dysfunction. Care ethics, developed by feminist philosophers like Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings, emphasizes the importance of relationships, of meeting needs, of attending to the particular circumstances of those we care about. But even care ethics recognizes that care must be sustainable. Noddings writes about caring for ourselves as part of the ethical caring relationship. We cannot care for others indefinitely if we do not also care for ourselves. The caregiver who burns out, who depletes themselves entirely, eventually has nothing left to give. So boundaries are not the opposite of love. Boundaries are what make love sustainable. They are what allow you to give genuinely, from fullness rather than obligation, from joy rather than resentment. Let me bring this to the practical present moment. How do you live with healthy boundaries in a world that constantly demands you give them up? Think about your workplace. How many of you work in environments where you're expected to answer emails at all hours? Where taking a vacation feels like a betrayal? Where saying, "I have too much on my plate," is seen as weakness? Mill's principle applies here. Your employer does not own you. They do not have sovereignty over your entire life. You have the right to protect your time, your mental health, your private life. And setting that boundary is not unprofessional. It's necessary for your long-term sustainability. Think about your family. How many of you have relatives who assume your time is always available? Who show up uninvited? Who expect you to drop everything whenever they call? Who take offense at the slightest indication that you have your own life? Kant's principle applies here. Even family members do not have the right to use you as a mere means to their ends. Love does not mean unlimited access. Respect means honoring each other's autonomy, including the autonomy to say no. Think about social media. How many of you feel pressure to be constantly available, constantly responsive, constantly engaged? To answer every message immediately? To maintain a public persona that's always positive, always accommodating? This is a modern form of boundary violation. The expectation that you are always accessible, that your attention is always available, that you owe the world constant engagement. But you don't. You have the right to disconnect, to be unavailable, to exist without performing. Think about the pandemic we've recently lived through. The debates about masks, vaccines, social distancing. These were all questions about boundaries. Where does my autonomy end and my responsibility to others begin? Mill's harm principle tried to answer this. We should be free except where our freedom harms others. But the key insight is this. Protecting yourself is not harming others. Taking care of your own well-being is not an act of aggression. You can care about the collective good while still maintaining boundaries that protect your own health and autonomy. So let me end by turning this back to you. I want you to reflect on these questions. Not to answer them out loud, but to sit with them. To be honest with yourself about what's really going on in your life. First, where have you disappeared? In what areas of your life have you become invisible to yourself? Where have you stopped asking what you want, what you need, what you believe is right? Second, whose agenda are you living? Whose dreams, whose expectations, whose version of success are you pursuing? Is it yours? Or have you adopted someone else's script and forgotten to question it? Third, what resentments are you carrying? What bitterness has built up because you said yes when you wanted to say no? Because you gave when you had nothing to give? Because you allowed yourself to be used? Fourth, What would change if you believed you had dignity? If you truly, deeply believed that you are an end in yourself, that your autonomy matters, that your needs are not negotiable, what would you do differently? Fifth, what are you afraid of? Because that's really what this is about, isn't it? We don't set boundaries because we're afraid. Afraid of conflict, afraid of rejection, afraid of being seen as selfish or difficult. But Sartre would ask, are you willing to abandon your own freedom because of fear? Sixth, who in your life respects your boundaries and who violates them? Make a list. Not to judge anyone, but to see clearly. Who treats you as an end in yourself? And who treats you as a means to their ends? And finally, what is one small boundary you can set today? Not next month. Not when things calm down. Today. What is one tiny way you can practice saying no, protecting your time, honoring your own needs? Because here's the truth. Philosophical principles are useless if they don't translate into action. You can understand Kant, Mill, Aristotle, Sartre, all of them, and still live a boundaryless life. Knowledge is not enough. You must practice. Setting boundaries is not easy. In fact, it's one of the hardest things you will ever do because it requires you to go against everything you've been taught, to disappoint people, to tolerate discomfort, to stand firm even when others push back. But it is also one of the most important things you will ever do, because it is how you claim your life as your own. It is how you honor your dignity. It is how you exercise your autonomy. It is how you maintain your integrity in a world that constantly demands you give it up. Remember, you are not a resource to be consumed. You are not a tool to be used. You are not a means to someone else's end. You are a person, a conscious, autonomous being with inherent worth and dignity. And when you protect that, when you set boundaries that honor your own humanity, you are not being selfish. You are being moral. You are respecting the very thing that makes you human, your freedom to govern your own life. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum writes about human capabilities, the things every person needs to flourish. Among them are bodily integrity, the ability to make choices about one's own life, and the capacity for self-determination. These are not luxuries. They are necessities, and boundaries are how you protect these capabilities. They are how you maintain the conditions necessary for your own flourishing. So today, I invite you to make a radical choice. Choose yourself, not in a narcissistic way, not by becoming cold or uncaring, but by recognizing that you matter, that your life is your own, that you have the right and indeed the responsibility to protect your own well-being. Set the boundary you've been afraid to set. Say the no you've been avoiding. Claim the space you've been denying yourself, not because it's easy, but because it's right. Because in the end, a life without boundaries is not a life of love. It's a life of slow disappearance. And you were not put on this earth to disappear. You were put here to exist fully, authentically, with dignity and autonomy intact. So exist, fully, unapologetically, with boundaries that honor the profound truth that you, just like every other human being, are an end in yourself. And that is not selfishness. That is wisdom.